The Arizona Canyon did not echo the gunshot. It swallowed it. One moment a man on horseback, the next silences, and the horse running south with a body draped across its neck, bleeding into the red dust of the Dragoon Mountains. Someone had wanted him dead before he reached town. He almost made it. The horse stopped at the edge of a small porch. The man fell, and the woman who opened that door, she should have closed it again. Every sensible instinct she had said close it. She didn't. Inside that apothecary, wrapped in oilskin and buried under 2 years of deliberate silence, was a journal. A dead man's handwriting, a name that connected a federal badge to a canyon full of unmarked graves, boots on gravel, coming up the street. Slow, certain, the kind of certain that meant someone already knew. The Arizona sky did not ease into evening, it collapsed. One moment the sun hung flat and merciless over the red rock ridges east of Copperstone, burning the scrub brush down to pale silver. The next, the light cracked open like a struck match and bled out across the horizon in streaks of bruised orange and violent amber. The canyon walls caught it and threw it back, doubled it, made the whole world look like something on fire that hadn't started burning yet. Clara Reed stood at her front window and watched it happen. She did this most evenings. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Because it was the one moment in the day when Copperstone seemed to hold its breath. When the men coming out of the assay office stopped walking. When the women on the far side of Main Street paused their conversations mid-sentence. When everyone, for just a few seconds, forgot to look past her, she exhaled slowly, turned back to her work table. The apothecary smelled of dried sage and crushed yarrow, and the faint mineral bite of clay dust that crept under every door in this part of Arizona territory, no matter how tightly you packed the gaps. Clara had stopped fighting it 2 years ago. The dust won. The dust always won out here. You either made peace with it or you left. She had made peace with most things she could not change and was still working on the rest. The work table ran the full length of the north wall. Glass jars lined the shelves above it in 3 careful rows, each one labeled in her own handwriting, compact, precise letters that left no room for misreading. Willow bark, osha root, dried creosote, Mormon tea, desert marigold. Mountain mint that she'd traded 3 tinctures of pain salve to get from the traveling merchant who came through in April and wouldn't be back until October. She kept the mint in the second jar from the left on the top shelf, where the morning light hit it first and reminded her it was still alive. Small things. You held on to the small things. She was grinding dried roots into powder with the heavy stone mortar when the letter appeared. Not through the mail. There was no knock, no footsteps on the porch boards that she would have heard. She always heard footsteps. Had trained herself to hear them the way a person trained themselves to hear a rattlesnake in tall grass, which was to say without thinking about it, only feeling the back of the neck go tight. One moment the gap beneath her front door held nothing but a thin line of fading daylight. The next, a folded square of paper lay on the plank floor. Clara set down the mortar, crossed the room, picked it up. The paper was cheap, the kind used for grocery lists and quick notes, already soft at the folds from someone's damp hands. The writing was cramped and slanted hard to the right, written fast, written by someone whose hand was shaking or whose time was short. Leave. Before he gets here. That was all. No name, no signature. No indication of which he or what here meant, though Clara suspected whoever wrote it assumed she would understand both. She stood there holding it, reading it twice more, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming on the second or third pass. They didn't. She folded the paper along its existing creases and slid it into her apron pocket, went back to the mortar, picked it up, set it down again. Because the thing about a warning without a name was that it took up more space than a warning with one. A named threat had a shape. You could look at it straight, measure it, decide what to do. An unnamed threat just sat in your chest like a stone and made everything else heavier. She went to the window. Copperstone's main street ran east to west, maybe 200 yards of packed dirt wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without touching. The buildings on either side were the particular shade of sun-bleached timber that started out brown and ended up the color of old bone. Halvorson's Dry Goods, the assay office with its narrow windows, the livery at the far end, where Tommy Briggs was walking the last horse of the evening into the stable with the slow patience of a man who had nowhere to be and knew it. Normal. Quiet. The kind of quiet that in Copperstone meant nothing was wrong, and then it wasn't quiet anymore. 5 horses came in from the eastern road at a pace that was not quite a gallop but was not a walk either. That middle speed that said we have been riding hard and we are choosing now to appear unhurried. Clara watched them come down the center of the street, 4 riders flanking a 5th who rode at the front, not because he was fastest, but because the others had arranged themselves around him, the way water arranged itself around a stone. The man in front was not young, not old either, but done with young in the way that some men were the kind of done that looked like certainty from a distance and something harder up close. He wore a long dust coat the color of dried clay, dark beard threaded through with iron gray, straight-backed in the saddle despite however many miles he'd put behind him. On his chest, catching the last weak slant of evening light and throwing it back doubled, was a U.S. Marshal's badge. He stopped his horse directly in front of her window. Not at the sheriff's office, not at the saloon, not at the livery where a man riding hard all day would normally head first. Here, in front of her window, he looked in. Clara did not step back from the glass. She had learned early that stepping back from things rarely made them smaller, it just gave you less information about them. She stood exactly where she was and looked at the man looking at her, and she thought, he has a face that has practiced being pleasant for a very long time. He wasn't smiling, but the arrangement of his features suggested he could produce a smile quickly and convincingly whenever one was required. That was the thing about a certain kind of dangerous man. The pleasantness wasn't a mask over something harder. The pleasantness was the hard thing. It was the weapon. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he moved his horse on down the street toward the sheriff's office, and his 4 riders followed, and the street settled back into its ordinary silence. Clara's hands were completely steady. Her heart was doing something else entirely. She reached into her apron pocket and touched the folded paper. Before he gets here. Well, he was here now, which meant whoever had written the note was either watching from somewhere close enough to slide paper under her door, or they had known he was coming before he arrived and had tried to give her enough time to do something about it. She hadn't done anything about it. She hadn't known what to do. She turned away from the window. The cedar chest was in the corner of the back room, under the extra quilts, where she had put it the day she arrived in this house, and where it had remained for 2 years closed. She knew what was inside it. She had known from the first week when Thomas's cousin had brought it over along with the rest of Gerald Reed's things after Gerald died. And the cousin had said, here's his papers and such. Figured you'd want to go through them at some point. And Clara had said thank you and put the chest in the back corner and not gone through them. She had not opened it then. She was not going to open it tonight. Not yet. Not until she understood what was walking toward her and from which direction. She went back to the mortar. Ground dried roots into fine powder, the familiar rhythm of it, the weight of the stone, the circular motion, the smell of something medicinal releasing slowly into the air worked on her the way it always did. Steadied her hands, steadied her breathing. Could not entirely steady the thing behind her sternum, but 2 out of 3 was acceptable. She worked until the light outside went fully dark and the oil lamp on the table became necessary rather than supplementary. She was sealing the last jar of the evening when she heard it, not the hoofbeats first. The horse first, gasping, that sound a horse pushing past the edge of what it had left. Lungs working in great wet heaves was not a sound you forgot once you had heard it. Clara had heard it twice before. Once when the Jensen boy came racing into town to get the doctor for his father's broken leg and ran his mare into the ground getting there. Once when a cavalry dispatch rider came through moving so fast he blew straight past Copperstone before he realized he'd missed it. Both times she had recognized the sound before she saw the animal. She recognized it now. She was at the door before she fully thought about it, pulled it open. The horse came in from the North Road, which was the wrong direction for a horse coming from anywhere sensible. The North Road went up into the Dragoon Mountains and continued into nothing useful for a long time after that. It was a roan, dark with sweat until the coat looked almost black, head hanging in a way that meant the animal was past asking questions and operating only on whatever last fuelless instinct kept the legs moving. It came through the gate in her low fence, which was open because she had been meaning to fix the latch for 3 weeks, and stopped at the foot of her porch steps, and the man on its back fell, not in pieces. All at once, the way large things fell without warning, without a gradual process of losing balance. Just a sudden transfer from vertical to horizontal that the ground received with a heavy finality. He hit the packed dirt of her path shoulder first and did not move after that. Clara was down the steps in the time it took her to understand what she was looking at. Mountain man was the word that came to her, and it was not an unkind word, only an accurate one. He was enormous in the way of men who worked against resistant terrain, not the bulk of a man fed well and kept idle, but the kind of mass that came from daily negotiation with rock and elevation and weather. She could see that even with him on the ground, even in the poor light from the doorway behind her, buckskin shirt, dark trousers, boots that had been resoled at least once, hair black and long tied back simply at the nape of his neck, broad face, strong jaw, the kind of cheekbones that came from a particular ancestry. The right shoulder of his buckskin shirt was soaked through. Dark and wet and not from sweat, she knelt beside him, 2 fingers to the side of his throat, pulse there fast, too fast, but present and finding its rhythm. Fever already building under her hands when she pressed her palm briefly to his forehead. He had been riding for a long time with that wound, long enough for his body to start fighting something it wasn't sure it could win. She looked up from him to the dark street beyond her fence. Nothing, no one. The town of Copperstones was asleep or pretending to be, which amounted to the same thing. She thought about what she was doing. Let herself have 5 full seconds to think about it clearly, because she was not a foolish woman and foolish women did not consider consequences before acting while sensible women did, and she had always considered herself sensible. She knew what this man was, the particular set of his features, the cut of his clothes, the direction he had come from. She could read the general shape of the situation even without details. A man shot in the northern mountains, riding south into town from the direction of the high canyon country. A man who looked like he looked. She thought about what Silas Dent had looked like through her window, the badge on his chest. The way he had looked directly at her, not past her, not around her, but at her with the specific attention of someone who had come for something specific before he gets here. Too late for before. This was after, and this man bleeding in her front yard was somehow part of the same sentence. She hooked her hands under his arms. He was heavier than she had prepared herself for. Significantly heavier. She was not a small woman. 5 years of frontier life had seen to that. And before that a childhood in a household where no one else was going to carry the wood in or haul the water up from the well if she didn't. But this was different from hauling wood. This was 200 pounds of unconscious man with no cooperation to offer. She pulled anyway, got him moving, got him up the steps one agonized haul at a time, his boots dragging twin furrows through the dirt of her path and then scraping across the porch boards. She got him through the door, got him across the main room, knocking the corner of the work table and sending 2 empty jars rolling, both of which she noted and both of which stayed unbroken. She got him onto her bed, stood there for a moment with her hands on her knees, breathing. Then she closed the front door, dropped the iron latch and went to work. The wound was a bullet wound. She had treated 2 others in the 2 years she'd been running the apothecary, and she recognized the shape of the problem, the entry point, the tissue damage around it, the way the body was already doing what bodies did when something foreign punched through them without permission. The bullet had gone through rather than lodged, which was better than the alternative. Still bad. Bad enough to have felled a man this size at the end of a long ride. She heated water. She brought out clean linen from the trunk. She reached up for the yarrow 3rd jar from the right on the 2nd shelf, and she knew that without looking, and for the dried plantain leaf and the thin-cut willow bark that she soaked in hot water until it softened. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had long since learned that panic was a luxury that used time she needed for something else. He was burning with fever by the time she had the wound properly cleaned and packed. She could feel the heat radiating off his skin when she reached across him to straighten the linen. She pressed a damp cloth to his forehead, and he didn't stir. She replaced it. Did it again. Did it 7 more times across the next 2 hours. Sitting in the straight-backed wooden chair she had pulled to the side of the bed, listening to the sound of his breathing even out and roughen and even out again. The lamp burned low. She trimmed the wick. The night outside was desert quiet, which was never entirely silent. There were things that moved out there in the dark that preferred the hours after midnight. And occasionally you heard them, a distant sound of wings or the far-off conversation of coyotes working a dry wash somewhere east of town. Clara had grown accustomed to those sounds. They were honest sounds. They didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. At some point past midnight, the man on her bed said a word in his fever. She had been half dozing in the chair, chin beginning to drift toward her chest, and the sound pulled her upright before she fully registered what it was. She sat still, listened. He said it again. 2 words, not one. Morning sky, said in a particular way, not the way a man said a name in passing, not the way someone referenced a time of day. The way a person said something they had trained themselves not to say out loud, and the fever had dissolved whatever control kept it back. A name. Someone's name. Someone specific, someone gone. Someone whose absence had left a shape in him that 3 words of deliriums could still find in the dark. Clara sat very still and listened to him breathe and did not pretend she hadn't heard it. Then another word. Rough, barely formed around the edges the way fever words often were, but clear enough. Voss. She went still in a different way entirely. The name settled into the room and did not move, did not expand or contract, just sat there, taking up exactly as much space as it deserved, which was considerable. Clara looked at the man on her bed. She looked at the linen she had pressed against his shoulder to stop the bleeding. She looked at her hands, which were stained dark at the fingertips in a way that washing would help but not fully fix. She thought about the man she had watched ride down her street 5 hours ago. The badge. The way he had looked through her window with a particular instant, someone who already knew what they were looking at and was only confirming it. She reached into her apron pocket and touched the folded paper. Leave. She had not left. And now she had a wounded stranger in her bed who knew the same name as the man with the badge. The fever broke just before dawn. She knew it had broken because the quality of his breathing changed. Something about the labored urgency in it eased. The way a river eased after the main force of a flood passed and settled back toward its channel. She was awake when it happened, sitting forward in the chair, elbows on her knees, watching his face. She had not slept. She was no longer trying. His skin was still warm when she pressed the back of her hand briefly to his forehead. But the terrible radiating heat had dropped to something that felt more like effort than emergency. She was reaching across him to adjust the cloth when his eyes opened. No warning. No gradual surfacing. They simply opened, dark, immediate, and entirely awake, in the way of a man who had learned that the distance between sleeping and ready was a distance that could kill you. His hand closed around her wrist, not gently, not roughly either. The grip was precise, exactly the amount of force required to stop movement, calibrated in the way that suggested he had practiced the motion so many times it had become part of how his body thought. Clara stopped moving. She had been expecting something like this and had made up her mind, in the long hours of the night, exactly how she was going to handle it. She looked at him. He looked at her. Taking in information the way she had seen good trackers take in a piece of ground, not just seeing the surface, but reading what was underneath. He took in her face, her hands, the lamp, the shelves of jars, the linen she had been reaching for. Then he looked at his own shoulder, at the clean, careful dressing covering it. You are at my house. She kept her voice even. Factual. I am going to change your dressing. That is all that is happening. You are not in danger from me. He said nothing. The grip did not loosen. I know it is not your habit to take people at their word. She continued in the same tone she used when she had to explain a dosage to someone frightened of medicine. I know you have reasons for that. So I am not asking you to take my word. I am asking you to look at the evidence available to you. You are on a clean bed. Your wound has been packed and dressed deft. You have been here several hours. If I intended you harm, I have had ample opportunity and you are in no condition to have prevented it. Something in the darkness of his eyes shifted. Not softened exactly, but moved, the way a decision moved across a person's face when they were making one. Slowly, the grip on her wrist loosened. His hand fell back to the quilt. Clara exhaled once, carefully, so it didn't sound like what it was. Then she finished adjusting the cloth and reached for the fresh linen. Her hands were completely steady. She was very proud of that. The man watched her work. She was aware of it the way she was aware of most things, steadily, peripherally, without making it the center of her attention. His focus was not threatening. It was the intent, gathering concentration of a person cataloging information they did not yet know what to do with. My name is Clara Reed, she said, not looking up from what she was doing. I run the apothecary. I have been running it alone for 2 years. He did not offer his name. She had not expected him to, not yet. The days that followed did not move in straight lines. Illness did not progress tidily, and neither did his recovery. He slept in long stretches that left her time to work at the table, and then he was awake and alert for hours at a stretch. And then the fever spiked again briefly on the second night, not as bad as the first, but enough to require her attention, enough to keep her in the chair again past midnight. She learned him in pieces. The way you learned a piece of difficult terrain, not all at once, but each time you passed through it, noting something new. He was precise with his body, even injured, even medicated with willow bark tea that she had to more or less insist he drink. The economy of his movements was remarkable. He did not shift unnecessarily. He did not reach for something unless he needed it. He ate what she brought him without complaint and without enthusiasm, with the practical efficiency of a man who had long since stopped thinking of food as anything other than fuel. He watched her shelves. Not her shelves, the careful rows of jars, the labels she had written herself. On the third morning, when she was organizing the upper row, she heard him speak in daylight for the first time. "You know the OSHA route." She turned. He was propped against the headboard, looking at the shelves, and his voice was lower than she had expected, rough around the edges from disuse and fever, but with a resonance that seemed to start somewhere further down in the chest than most voices did. "I know most of what's on those shelves," she said. "Not what I mean." He studied the jars for another moment. "You know it. The difference between collected in spring versus autumn. The way the roots should smell when properly dried versus when they are not. A pause that had something considering in it. Who taught you?" "Nobody taught me." That was the true answer. She had taught herself from books and from trial and considerably more error than she would have preferred, and from 3 years of asking questions of anyone who would answer them. She had read everything she could find and then gone looking for the things the books described and learned by touch and smell, and the occasional near disaster what the written descriptions actually meant in practice. "Books," she said, and touched stubbornness. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face and was gone before she could be certain of it. He told her his name on the 4th day. Caleb Morrow. He said it without preamble, as though continuing a conversation that had been running in his head for a while, and he had simply decided to speak the next line aloud. "Caleb Morrow," she repeated, because she had found it mattered to say a name back to someone who had just trusted you with it. He nodded once. Then, "I am from the Dragoon Mountains. The northern ridges." She had guessed the mountains. The direction he had come from and the particular wear pattern on his boots, the kind of wear that came from years of navigating loose shale and uneven stone rather than flat packed ground, had told her that much. "How long have you been up there?" 3 years. Something in the way he said it made her not ask the obvious follow-up question. There was a category of 3 years that meant 3 years since something happened, and the way a person said it told you which kind this was. She went back to her work. Outside, Copperstone moved through its ordinary days, and Clara moved through hers with a careful attention to ordinary that was itself a kind of effort. She went to Halvorson's for supplies each morning as usual. She opened the apothecary to whoever came, which was not many, it was never many, and she had long since accepted that. She was pleasant to the people who came in. She was unremarkable. She gave no one a reason to ask questions they didn't already have. She did not see Silas Dent for 3 days after his arrival. Then she saw him twice in one morning, once crossing the street near the sheriff's office, once standing outside the saloon talking to 2 men she didn't recognize. He did not appear to be in any hurry about anything. He appeared to be settling in, which told her more than his badge did. Men with legitimate business finished it and moved on. Men who waited were waiting for something specific, and moved only when they had obtained it. She said nothing to Caleb about what she saw. He was still healing, and she had no framework yet for what to do with the information herself, so offering it incomplete and unstructured struck her as both unkind and impractical. But the paper in her apron pocket grew heavier, in the way that things you were not yet ready to act on grew heavier the longer you carried them. It was on the 6th day, a Tuesday evening, the sun just off the edge of the western ridgeline. The sky streaked through with the particular violent orange that appeared only in the hour after a day of hard heat that she brought water out to the sawn-off bench in the back of the property. She had heated it on the stove in the big iron pot. She had a tin cup and a bar of the mild soap she made herself from rendered fat and dried lavender, because the commercial soap from Halvorson's tended to take skin off along with whatever it was cleaning. She had clean linen for the shoulder when they were finished. Caleb was already sitting on the bench. He had gotten there himself, which was progress. He had removed Thomas's old work shirt, which had fit him exactly as poorly as could be expected, being slightly too short in the arms, and it sat folded across his knees. He sat with his back to the wall of the shed, eyes moving across the canyon ridgeline to the east with the idle focus of a man reading something he already mostly knew. Clara set the basin down on the ground beside the bench. His back was a record. That was how she had come to think of it when she changed his dressings, not as something to flinch from, but as something to read. The old scars, faded to white and silver against the darker bronze of his skin, each one with a shape that suggested a specific kind of violence or accident. A blade once, probably. A fall onto rock. There was one on his left shoulder blade that she had no tidy category for, and had stopped or to find one. The wound she had treated, now healing cleanly, added something new to the record. She was glad it would heal cleanly. "Lean back," she said. He leaned back, rested his head against the edge of the wooden basin she had set up, the unhurried compliance of someone who had made a decision and was not going to unmake it. She poured the warm water over his hair. The sound of it running off into the basin was the only sound for a stretch of seconds. The water, the distant conversation of two birds somewhere in the scrub brush beyond the fence. The soft drag of the laundry on the line above them moving in a breath of air that barely qualified as wind. She worked the soap into lather between her palms and set her hands into his hair. The first thing she noticed was that he went entirely still, not tense, not braced. A different quality of stillness, the kind that required something of a person rather than being the absence of effort. She worked her fingertips slowly across his scalp, working the lather through. The weight of his hair was different than she had expected, though she had not realized she had been expecting anything until she encountered the difference. She moved from the crown on down toward the nape, and he let out a slow breath that she felt more than heard. She rinsed, refilled the cup, rinsed again. Then her fingertips found the scar near his left shoulder blade and stilled. She had not intended to stop. It was not a conscious decision. Her fingers simply paused on the raised line of old tissue, light as anything, lighter than she usually touched things, and she stayed there without moving. His hand came up. Left hand, moving slowly enough that she tracked it without alarm. His fingers found hers where they rested against his wet skin. He did not look at her. He simply pressed her hand, palm flat, against his chest, directly over the place where the heartbeat was loudest. She could feel it, steady, unhurried, solid, a percussion that had nothing to do with the urgency of the fever she had monitored for 6 nights and everything to do with a man sitting very quietly in the afternoon sun and choosing, for reasons he had not explained and she had not asked for, to hold her hand against his heart. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The laundry moved on the line above them. The birds somewhere in the scrub brush continued their conversation, which had its own rhythm and its own urgency that had nothing to do with the two people on the bench below them. Clara moved eventually, gently withdrew her hand, reached for the fresh linen to redress the shoulder. Caleb said nothing. She said nothing. The moment did not require quite anything more from either of them than it had already taken, and she was grateful for that. She was sealing the jars of the evening some 2 hours after the backyard when she heard the knock, 4 sharp raps on the front door, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who was not in a hurry and wanted that fact understood. Clara set down the lid she was holding. She looked toward the back room where Caleb was. He had heard it too, she could tell by the particular quality of the silence that replaced the small sounds of a person at rest. There was a version of stillness that meant sleep, and a version that meant attention, and she had learned the difference between them across 6 nights of sitting in a chair. She went to the door. She had known, somewhere beneath the region of thought, that it would come to this. Since the moment she had watched that badge catch the evening light 3 days ago, since the tuck of paper under her door, since Caleb's fever had spoken a name she recognized, she had known it would come. A man who looked through windows and waited had arrived at whatever point he had been waiting to arrive at. She opened the door. Silas Dent stood on her porch with his hat in one hand and an expression of pleasant concern arranged across his features. Up close, he was taller than she had registered from the window, tall and broad through the shoulders, but the breadth distributed in a way that somehow minimized itself. A man who had learned to take up less space than he actually occupied. The badge caught the lamplight from inside her doorway. Mrs. Reed, his voice was easy. Conversational, forgive the hour. I wanted to check on folks after that wind the other night. Did you come through it all right? There had not been a storm. There had been wind. Any woman who had lived in Arizona territory for more than a season did not classify wind as something to check on people about. Perfectly well, she said. Thank you, Marshal. Good. He glanced past her shoulder with the professional ease of someone who made a point of always glancing outwards, making it seem casual enough that you almost didn't notice. Almost. I don't suppose I could trouble you for a moment. A few questions I have to ask most folks in the area. Regarding Gerald Reed, the name landed in the conversation like a stone dropped from a height. It made a sound, even if that sound was only inside her chest. Gerald Reed has been dead for 3 years, she said. Yes, ma'am, I am aware of that, he smiled. A gold-toothed look caught the light. It's more his business dealings I'm interested in. Specifically, I have reason to believe he left behind some personal papers. A journal, perhaps. Might contain information relevant to a federal matter. Clara kept her face in the same arrangement it had been in since she opened the door. This was something she was good at. She had practiced it. Not deliberately, but through the years of being looked at by this town as the woman with the Reed name, the woman with the Reed history, and learning that the face you offered to the world was a thing you could choose even when the things behind it were not. I would know about that, she said. Gerald's belongings came to me when he passed, but I haven't gone through most of it. Papers and such. Dent looked at her. She looked back at him. The pleasantness of his features did not shift, but something behind it recalibrated. She could see it happening, the small adjustment of a man who had expected one kind of response and was filing away a different kind for later use. Of course, he said. Well, if you happen to come across anything of that nature, a record book, a journal, maps perhaps, I'd appreciate knowing. Federal interest in the matter. Another easy smile. Good evening, Mrs. Reed. Good evening, Marshal. She closed the door, stood with her back against it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she crossed the room to the back doorway. Caleb was sitting up in the bed, fully awake, eyes on her face. He had heard every word. The walls in this house were not thick. Silas Dent, Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was slightly surprised. He is here in Copperstone. He is wearing a U.S. Marshal's badge, and he came to my door asking about Gerald Reed's papers. Something happened in Caleb's face then. Not one thing, several things. In rapid sequence, each one replacing the last before she could fully read them. Recognition. A cold and controlled fury, contained so precisely it barely showed on the surface, which meant it was extremely large underneath, and beneath both of those, something older and more permanent, like a wound that had healed over but had changed the shape of the skin around it. He shot me, Caleb said, not as though it were new information, as though he were confirming the correctness of a conclusion he had already reached. On the northern ridge. Nearly a week ago, he shot you. She said it back because it needed to be said aloud to be real. He had 3 men with him. They tracked me from the canyon pass. His jaw tightened. He does not know for certain that I survived the ride down. Clara stood still and thought about this, and about the badge, and about the easy pleasantness of Dent's features, and about the words federal interest in the matter. Caleb. She moved to the cedar chest in the corner, the one she had not opened. She was aware of every step she was taking, the floorboards under her feet, the weight of 2 years of deliberate avoidance pressing against her chest. She knelt in front of it, undid the latch. There is something I need to show you. She lifted out the top quilt, the one with the lavender sashes she had sewn into the corners to keep moths out. Beneath it, the extra blanket. Beneath the blanket, at the bottom of the chest, a flat oilskin-wrapped package tied with a strip of leather that had stiffened with age and the dry heat. She had known it was there. She had known since the first week. She had decided not to know what was inside it, and had maintained that decision with the stubborn discipline of someone who understood that some information, once received, changes the shape of everything after it, and cannot be unchanged. She brought the package to the table, set it down, looked at it for a moment. Then she untied the leather strip, the oilskin unfolded to reveal a journal. brown cover worn at the corners. The leather softened in the particular way of something handled often with hands that were not always clean. Gerald Reed's handwriting on the inside cover, the same cramped slant she recognized from the few documents she had seen of his. G.W. Reed. His record. 1878 to 1881. Her hands were shaking now. She noticed that. Put them flat on the table on either side of the journal and pressed down until they steadied. "My father-in-law," she said, and the words tasted like something she had been holding in her mouth for 2 years without swallowing. Gerald Reed. He was a prospector. He worked the mountain country north of here. Thomas, my husband, never spoke of it. I knew Gerald had been into the northern canyons. I knew there was. She stopped. Started again. I knew there was talk about what he had found there and what he had done with it. Caleb's eyes went to the journal, came back to her face. In his face, she saw the thing she had been afraid of seeing, not anger, though the anger was there, vast and controlled. What she saw beneath it was recognition. The recognition of someone who had spent 3 years carrying the shape of something that had happened, and was now, for the first time, looking at the specific object that had given that shape its edges. "I have not opened it," she said. "In 2 years. I have known it was there, and I have not opened it." She opened it now. The first page was a date and a location and a list of supplies. Ordinary enough. She turned pages. The handwriting became hurried in some places, careful in others. She found the first mention of the Northern Canyon country on the 14th page. Found the first sketched lines that might have been a rough map 3 pages after that. Found the name on the 22nd page, written and underscored twice. She read the line aloud without deciding to. "Met with Dent today regarding the arrangement. He will see to the military matter. I provide the location. Terms agreed. The terms, the arrangement, the military matter." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a door closed. One of the horses at the livery made a sound and went quiet again. The oil lamp on the table burned with a sound that was almost nothing, a faint continuous breath. Clara set the journal down. She kept her hands flat on the table. She was crying, which she had not expected, and she was briefly angry at herself about that in a secondary way that was much smaller than the other things moving through her. At that moment he made an arrangement, she said. Her voice was entirely steady except for one word in the middle of the sentence. "Gerald Reed, my husband's father. He made an arrangement with Silas Dent. He provided the location of the Apache settlement in the Northern Canyon, and Dent arranged the military response." She looked up at Caleb. "That is what the journal contains." Caleb Morrow had gone very still, in the way she had come to recognize as his deepest stillness, not absence but presence, an intensified presence. The way a candle burned brighter in the last moments before a wind reached it. His voice, when he came, was completely level. "Morning sky is buried in that canyon." She closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them. "I know. She is buried there because of what is written in that journal, I know, and Dent is here for it." Yes, she was still crying. She was not going to apologize for that. She was not going to minimize it or offer it up for him to manage. She had been carrying the weight of a name for 2 years. She had carried it without knowing its full dimensions. And now the full weight of what that name contained had arrived in her hands on a Tuesday evening, in a house that still smelled of the man who had built the arrangement that made it all possible. And she was feeling the weight of that, and she was not pretending she wasn't. Caleb stood. He was still favoring the injured shoulder, still holding some careful awareness of it in how he moved, but he stood and he crossed the room, and he stopped directly in front of her. He was very tall when you were standing close to him. She had known this. It registered differently with 12 inches between them and her eyes still wet, and the journal open on the table. He did not reach for the journal. He raised his uninjured hand and pressed his thumb gently under her chin, lifting her face until she had no choice but to meet his gaze. In his dark eyes there was no contempt, no distance. Only the profound and level look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and recognized the specific posture of someone doing the same. "We do not carry the sins of those who came before us," he said, his voice a low and steady thing in the quiet room. "We only carry the choices we make from this day forward." The words struck her somewhere behind the sternum. A choked sound left her throat, not quite a sob, not quite relief. Something in between that had no clean category. The absolution she had never dared ask for. Offered without ceremony, without condition, by the one person whose authority to offer it was absolute. The wall of accumulated shame she had built around her chest stone by stone across 2 years of being the woman with the Reed name did not crumble dramatically. It simply became unnecessary. And unnecessary things, given enough time, found their way to the floor on their own. She breathed, the lamp burned, the journal open between them with all its terrible ordinary language, its logistics and its arrangements and its careful accounting of catastrophe. "Dent will come back," she said, when she could. "Yes, he will not leave this town without what he came for. No." Wagged at Artel, then at Caleb, then at the cedar chest in the corner, now open and empty of the thing it had been holding, and somehow lighter for it. "Then we need to decide what we are going to do," she said. That was not the same as having a plan. But it was, she had found, always where the plan had to begin with 2 people in a lamplit room at the end of a long night, deciding together that the thing in front of them was going to be faced rather than carried in silence, until it became too heavy for either of them alone. Outside, the desert night pressed its particular late-hour quiet against the walls of the apothecary. Inside, the lamp burned steady and low, and Clara Reed and Caleb Morrow sat down together at the table with Gerald Reed's journal between them and began slowly, with great care, to understand exactly what they were up against. The morning after Dent's visit, Clara made a decision, not the large one, not the one that would matter most, but a smaller decision that was the necessary precondition for the larger one, the way you had to strike the match before you could light anything with it. She decided to stop pretending the journal was a problem she could continue to defer. She was up before dawn, had been up most of the night, in the way that she had learned to manage sleeplessness, not fighting it, not lying in the dark, cataloguing her inability to sleep, but simply getting up and doing useful things in lamplight until the body made its peace with wakefulness and agreed to try again. She had ground the rest of the dried marigold. She had relabeled 4 jars whose writing had faded in the summer heat. She had read every page of Gerald Reed's journal from cover to cover, sitting at the work table with a cup of cold coffee going stale at her elbow. It took her 2 hours. When she finished, she sat for a long time without moving. Then she heard Caleb shift in the back room, the specific sound of a large man who had been lying still for several days beginning to negotiate with his body about the possibility of vertical. She got up, poured water into the kettle, put it on the stove. By the time he appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose shoulder was better but not finished, she had his willow bark tea steeping and the journal open on the table between the 2 chairs. He looked at the journal, looked at her face, read whatever was written there accurately enough that he didn't need to ask if she'd slept. "All of it," he said. "All of it," he sat. She sat across from him. Outside the window, the sky was doing the pale preliminary work of becoming morning, not quite light yet, that particular blue-gray that belonged to no time, and every time, the hour that couldn't decide what it was yet. She told him what the journal contained. Not reading from it, she had read it enough that she no longer needed to. She told him in the flat, even voice she used when there was a great deal of information that needed to be transmitted accurately, and emotion would only slow the transmission. Gerald Reed had entered the Northern Canyon country in the spring of 1879. He had spent 2 seasons mapping the canyon system, ostensibly prospecting, actually building a detailed record of every water source, every passage, every settlement. He had met Silas Dent in the fall of that year. Dent was not a marshal then. He was an independent contractor, that was Gerald's phrase for it, written without apparent irony, who worked jobs for men who needed things done without military accountability. The arrangement between them was simple. Gerald provided maps and the precise location of the Apache settlement in the Northern Canyon. Dent arranged Werrell's journal called the military resolution of the occupancy question. In exchange, Gerald received documented rights to mineral claims in the canyon country after the settlement was no longer a settlement, the military resolution. The occupancy question. Clara found herself reading those phrases 3 times each, turning them over, trying to find a reading of them that meant something less than what they meant. There wasn't one. Gerald Reed had used a prospector's language for what he had done, the dry transactional vocabulary of a man who had spent his life thinking of the landscape as a problem with a solution, and the people in it as variables in that problem rather than people in it. He had not used any word that meant murder. He had written about it the way a man wrote about the weather or the price of timber, or the settlement of a complicated business arrangement that had required some unpleasantness to finalize. He wrote about it as though it were nothing, Clara said, and stopped, tried again, as though it were another stop. She looked at Caleb. I cannot find the right word for what he treated it as. Caleb was looking at the journal, not at her. His hands were flat on the table, not tense, just present in the way that everything about him was present fully and without performance. Logistics, he said finally. Yes, that was exactly it. Logistics. He was quiet for a long time after that. She let him be quiet. She had learned in the past week that Caleb Morrow's silences were not absences, they were where he did his most serious thinking, and interrupting them was like stopping a clock mid-chime and expecting to still know what time it was. There is more, she said, when the silence had run its course. He looked at her. The last 8 pages, she found the place in the journal and turned it toward him. Gerald knew Dent was planning to kill him. He wrote it down, and there it was. 8 pages in Gerald Reed's increasingly erratic handwriting, the letters larger and less controlled as the anxiety behind them mounted. Gerald had believed by the spring of 1881 that Dent had decided the arrangement was tidier with one fewer party to it. Gerald knew too much about the specific terms. He had documentation, the journal itself, that Dent could not allow to exist in someone else's possession. Gerald had written in the second-to-last entry, I believe he will move before the end of the month. I am putting this away where it will not be easy to find. If someone finds it, know that Dent killed me for it, and know that the canyon claims were never legally transferred. The paperwork he has is forged. 3 weeks after that entry, Gerald Reed had died of what was recorded as a fall from a ridge above his claim. Clara had accepted that because everyone had accepted it. Because Gerald Reed, at 67 years old, working alone in the canyon country, falling from a ridge was not an improbable event. Because there was no reason to suspect anything else, and every reason to accept the simple explanation and get on with the business of being a widow in a town that was not especially interested in her grief. She accepted it less completely now. Caleb read the final 8 pages. He read slowly and he read everything, and when he finished, he set the journal down and looked at the window, which was fully light now, the blue-gray resolved into the flat white of an Arizona morning beginning its day's work. He does not know for certain that the journal exists, Caleb said. He suspects it. That's why he came to the door. But suspicion and certainty are different. Clara thought about this, about the way Dent had asked about papers and such with that practiced pleasantness that did not shift no matter what she said, about the way Hayes had gone past her shoulder into the room. He is not certain enough to act directly. Not yet. He will watch. He will wait to see if I do something that confirms it. And his men? I have seen 2 of them in town. There may be more I haven't identified. Caleb looked at the journal, then at her face. The weight of what was written in those pages sat between them like a third presence at the table, not comfortable, not avoidable, but at least no longer hidden. That was something. That was, Clara had come to believe, always the first necessary thing. There is one more thing the journal contains, she said. Gerald believed there was a second document, a military order authorizing the cavalry action signed by Dent and countersigned by a superior officer. Gerald never saw it, but he described it in detail. He said Dent kept it as insurance against his own commanding officers. She looked steadily at Caleb. If that document exists, it is more powerful than anything Gerald wrote in this journal. A dead man's private record can be argued against. An official military order with 2 signatures cannot. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, not louder, not harder, but with a different kind of weight behind it. I know where such a document might be, she waited. There is a man, he said. Old Crow. He lives in the canyon country northeast of here, in the high rock. He was in the settlement when a pause. That was not hesitation, but a careful choosing of what to say and what to leave in its proper place. He survived. He is the only one who did. He went back afterward. He found things. Another pause. He kept things. He told me once, 3 winters ago, that he had found a paper with a soldier's mark on it, thrown to the ground by men who did not believe anyone would come back to read it. The room was very still. He kept it, Clara said. He kept it because he said he was waiting for someone who would know what to do with it. She sat with this for a moment. Outside, the first sounds of the town starting its day drifted through the gap under the door. A wagon somewhere. The distant clang of the smithy beginning work, the ordinary percussion of a morning that did not know what was being discussed in the apothecary at its edge. "We need to go to him," she said. "Yes, but not yet. Not while Dent is watching and not while—" She stopped. "Change direction. First I need to do something here." He looked at her. "Owen Garrett," she said. "The newspaper. I am going to go give him a written account of what the journal contains, and I am going to ask him to keep it where Dent cannot reach it, and to send it to the territorial authorities if anything happens to either of us." She held Caleb's gaze. "Before I go to the canyon and before we move the journal out of this building, there needs to be a copy of what we know in the hands of someone. Dent cannot simply take it back from." Caleb looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention. She had learned not to mistake his insolences for uncertainty. He was not uncertain. He was thorough. There was a difference. "Go," he said. She went. Owen Garrett ran the Copperstone Clarion out of a narrow building 2 doors west of the dry goods store. A building so crowded with paper and equipment and the accumulated disorder of 30 years in the newspaper trade that entering it required a willingness to turn sideways at several points to navigate between stacked reams and the hulking metal permanence of the press. He was a small man of about 60, with ink permanently worked into the lines of his fingers, and a habit of looking at people from slightly sideways, as though the direct view were less reliable than the oblique one. He was at the press when she came in, working something mechanical with a tool she couldn't name, and he looked up at the sound of the bell above the door, Mrs. Reed. Then, after a moment in which he took in her face and the oilskin package under her arm, "You look like a woman who has made a decision." "I have made several." She went to the counter. "I need to give you something and I need you to write it down and keep what I give you somewhere safe. Somewhere Silas Dent and his men would not think to look and could not easily access without making themselves visible." Garrett set down his tool. The sideways look intensified not suspicion, she had come to understand, but the professional habit of a man who had spent his career deciding how much of what he heard was true and how much was something else. "That's an unusual request before 9 in the morning. It is an unusual situation." She told him not everything, not the full scope of it, but enough. Enough that when she left 40 minutes later, Owen Garrett had in his possession 3 pages of her careful handwriting summarizing the key entries from Gerald Reed's journal. The arrangement with Dent, the specific date and terms, Gerald's own account of what he believed Dent intended for him. She had also told Garrett in terms direct enough that there was no room for misreading, that if she or Caleb Morrow were to meet with any kind of misfortune in the near future, she expected him to use what she had given him. Garrett had looked at her from his oblique angle the entire time she spoke. When she finished, he said, "You know what you're doing? Not a question, I am working it out as I go," she said. "Which is the honest answer. Honest answers are rarer than you'd think in this business." He looked down at the 3 pages. "I'll put this with the papers, deed records. Nobody goes through those unless they know specifically what they're looking for. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Thank me if it works." She was back at the apothecary before Caleb had finished the willow bark tea. He looked at her the moment she stepped through the door, that inventory, that attentive reading of her face and posture. She had stopped finding it unsettling somewhere around day 4 and had started finding it, in a way she hadn't entirely examined, something she noticed the absence of more than the presence. "Done," she said. He nodded once, set down the cup. "Then we wait for the right moment to go north." They did not have to wait long for the moment to make itself known. It came 2 mornings later, not as a choice, but as a necessity. She smelled it before she heard it. Smoke, not the cooking smoke of the stove, a different kind, the kind with a specific edge to it that the body recognized before the mind caught up. She was out the back door before she had consciously decided to move. The small shed at the back corner of the property, where she kept the extra firewood and the large iron pots that didn't fit inside it, was burning along its west wall. The fire moving with the particular efficiency of something that had been encouraged along rather than started accidentally. Already the wall was half-gone. The flames were not going to spread to the main building, not with the distance between them and the wind running east this morning. But the shed was finished. Whatever had been inside it was finished. Clara stood and watched it burn. She was aware of Caleb coming out of the house behind her and stopping at her shoulder. She was aware of voices from the street. Someone had noticed the smoke, and there were people coming to look, then standing at a cautious distance doing the particular calculation that fires in dry country required, which was, is it contained enough to be someone else's problem? It was contained. Nobody came in through the gate. On the far wall of the shed, the section of board the fire had not yet reached, someone had drawn in heavy black char, a circle. Inside it, a single deep X. Clara looked at it. The fire reached that section of wall and the mark disappeared into it. "He is done waiting," she said. Caleb was already back inside. When she came in, he was pulling on his boots with the focused efficiency of a man who had shifted from one mode to another. The change was subtle and total, the way the quality of a room shifts when something in it has made a decision. "We leave tonight," he said. "North Road. Before he moves again, not tonight." She was already at the shelves. Now he looked at her. "If we wait until tonight, we are waiting on his schedule." She was taking down what mattered, the medications she couldn't replace easily, the ones someone might need in the coming days. Her money, which was not much, but was hers. The journal, wrapped back in its oilskin. "We go now, while his men are positioned for watching and not for moving. They will not expect us to leave before noon." A pause. "Brief? You are right," he said. She was. She did not say so. She finished packing. They went out the back before the shed had finished burning. The north road out of Copperstone followed the creek bed for the first miles before it abandoned the creek and climbed into the rocky scrub country where the vegetation changed from the thin green of riparian growth to the dry silver gray of high desert. Clara had been on this road twice before, once when she first arrived in Copperstone, coming from the south and passing through the Northern Territory on the way down, and once when she had gone looking for a particular type of root that only grew at higher elevation. Both times she had found potencies in the specific way of things that would kill you without much hesitation if you gave them the opportunity. Caleb moved ahead of her on the road, and then, when the road gave out, off the road onto ground that only looked like it had no path until you watched where he put his feet. She watched where he put his feet and put hers in the same places. His shoulder was better. She could tell by the way he moved. The slight favoring was still present, but it was not restraining him. Just a background awareness he accommodated without complaint. The man who had collapsed at the foot of her porched steps a week ago was not the man moving up a grade of loose shale with the quiet precision of something that had evolved specifically for this terrain. They moved for 2 hours without speaking. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the terrain required attention that excluded conversation, and because they had both arrived, separately and then together, at the understanding that silence between them did not need to be filled to be comfortable. It was already full of something. Neither of them had named it, and neither of them needed to yet. The drawl came not from behind them, but from the side. They were crossing a narrow ledge of red rock above a dry wash, when she heard a displacement of stone somewhere above and to the right, the specific sound of someone moving who did not know how to move on loose terrain and was compensating with speed rather than care. Caleb had stopped before she had fully identified the sound. His hand came back and found her arm not grabbing, just placing itself there, a directional instruction delivered through touch. She stopped. Below them in the wash, 2 men on horseback picking their way along the sandy floor, moving south to north, moving with the deliberate patience of men who were following something and did not want to lose it. Clara looked at the ledge ahead of them. Then at Caleb, up a wash, he said, barely a sound at all. "Higher ground, a different route. How much higher?" Enough to lose them. She did not point out that this was not a precise answer. She turned and followed him upward because when the alternative was 2 armed men in the wash below and the possibility of more behind them, enough was the most useful quantity available. The upper route required things she had not anticipated her body being asked to do. There was a gap not wide, but with the dry wash 40 feet below and the far side slightly lower than the near side, which changed the arithmetic in ways she didn't enjoy thinking about. Caleb went first and turned and held out his hand, and she took it and jumped and landed, and he caught her forward momentum with a solid arm across her back, and she was on the far side and they kept moving. She did not look down. Looking down was only useful if you had options that depended on what you saw. They pushed higher into Acadian country as the afternoon came apart around them. The sky had been building itself up along the western edge all afternoon in the way that Arizona sky did when it was preparing to make a statement. The clouds came in from the south-southwest, not the thin white variety that drifted harmlessly through the high blue, but the serious kind that turned a bruised green at the bottom edge and made a low pressure you felt in your ears before you heard the thunder. Monsoon, late in the season for it, but here all the same and not interested in anyone's schedule. Caleb had his eyes on the sky when the first crack of thunder rolled through the canyon and doubled back off the walls and doubled again till it sounded like something structural giving way. He changed direction without commentary, angling toward the canyon wall with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly where he was going. The rain arrived before they reached it. All at once. The way it fusted away arrived in this country from nothing to everything in 30 seconds. The temperature dropping sharply in the same interval. The red dust of the canyon floor turning instantly to the red mud that was the same substance with different intentions. It plastered her hair flat against her face. It turned the last hour of daylight into something gray and featureless. Caleb had his hand on her arm, guiding her along the canyon wall, reading something in the rock face that she couldn't read, until she could read it too, a shadow in the cliff that resolved as they got closer into a narrow opening. A horizontal fissure in the sandstone that went back far enough to be useful. They squeezed inside. The sound of the rain on the canyon floor became a different thing from inside the rock. Still present, but localized outside, not here. Here was its territory, with its own specific air. Old stone and damp earth, and a mineral coolness that had nothing to do with the temperature drop outside, and everything to do with the depth of the rock surrounding them. Caleb had a short candle stub in his coat. She had put it there 4 days ago when she gave him the coat, tucking it into the pocket without thinking, and he had kept it there as a matter of habit. He lit it. The flame jumped twice in the air, moving through the fissure, and then settled into a small, steady yellow. They sat with their backs against the stone. There was not much space between them, not as a choice, simply as a fact of the fissure's dimensions. Clara felt the cold then. When they had been moving, she had not felt it. The exertion and the urgency of the descent had served as sufficient insulation. Now that they were still, the cold came in from the wet rock behind her and the damp clothes against her skin. She had her arms around herself, which helped marginally. Caleb shifted. Without asking anything, he simply moved to be beside her rather than next to her, his arm around her shoulders, the warmth of him immediate and substantial. She leaned into it directly, without deliberation. The way you moved toward warmth when you were cold enough that the considerations which might otherwise complicate the decision were simply outweighed by physical need. They sat like that while the rain hammered the canyon floor outside and the candle made its small, determined argument against the dark. After a while he said, "Tell me about Thomas." She had not expected it. Not as a question and not as an opening. Though she understood why he asked it, they had arrived at a particular proximities over the past week, the kind built from shattered danger and the specific trust of a person who had handled your body when it was broken and had not treated the handling carelessly. That kind of closeness had edges that needed to be understood, or you ran into them in the dark. He was kind, she said, genuinely. Not the fun-pump kind that required an audience, the real kind that was simply how he was made. She looked at the candle. He was 20 years older than me, and we both understood. The arrangement was as much practical as it was anything else. He needed someone to manage the house and the apothecary when his health started failing. I needed a situation that wasn't the one I had. She paused. I cared for him, he cared for me. It was not nothing. Caleb was quiet for a moment, but it was not everything. No, it was not everything. The rain continued. The candle burned down a 1/4 inch. She said his name before she had decided to. Morning sky. She felt him go still beside her. Not a way just gathered, the way you gathered yourself before saying something that was going to cost you. She did not apologize for the name. She had earned the right to say it through a week of caring for the man who carried it. You loved her completely, she said. It was not a question, and he did not treat it as one. She laughed at things I didn't understand were funny until she laughed at them, he said, his voice even in the particular way of something that had been practiced into evenness over a long time. And then I couldn't understand why I had never noticed them before. A pause. She died while I was away. I had taken work that required me to be away. When I came back, he stopped. Started again from a different place. I have not been able to put down the idea that I could have chosen differently. Clara turned her head to look at him. He was looking at the candle. His jaw was set in that particular way, the way of a man holding something that would be larger than the room if he released it. Caleb, she waited until he looked at her. You were not the architect of what happened. You were used by the man who was. The difference between those two things is not a small difference. It is the entire distance between guilt and grief, and you have been carrying both as though they weighed the same. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched, then he looked away. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Something had shifted the weight, not removed it, but changed where it was sitting in a way that was perhaps marginally more survivable going forward. She became aware, gradually and then all at once, of how close they were. The candle had burned to almost nothing. Outside, the rain was still going, but had dropped from its peak to a steadier sound, the sound of rain that intended to continue, but was no longer trying to prove anything about it. The warmth between them had become mutual, no longer just him warming her, but a combined thing that neither of them was producing independently anymore. His free hand found hers in the near dark, not reaching, just finding, the way two things in the same small space eventually came into contact, because that was what proximity did over enough time. She did not move her hand. After a long moment, he said quietly, I do not know what this is. No, she agreed. Neither do I. I know that I have not. He stopped. Tried again. Not since morning sky. She understood what he wasn't finishing. I know, and I do not know if Caleb, she said it gently, not to stop him but to redirect him. You do not have to know what it is tonight. Tonight it is just this two people in a cold place, not alone. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the tension in the hand holding hers eased. She rested her head against his shoulder. Not a decision. Just a fact of gravity and exhaustion and the particular arithmetic of two people who had been through a great deal in one day and were nowhere near finished. He did not move, just sat, accepted it. The candle went out and the dark came in, and the rain was a sound, and the warmth between them was a fact, and none of what was waiting outside the fissure had gone away. But it was not in here, and right now that was the only thing that needed to be true. She woke in the dark to Caleb already awake beside her. She knew it without seeing, could tell from the quality of the stillness, which was alert still and not sleep still, the distinction she had learned across a week of sitting in a chair beside his bed. She lifted her head from his shoulder. How long did I sleep? 3 hours. Maybe a little more. She sat up. The cold returned immediately, having only been held at bay, and she pulled her coat tighter. The rain stopped an hour ago. She listened. He was right. The canyon outside was quiet in the way of a place that had just been through something and was still deciding what it was going to be now that it was over. Outside the fissure, the canyon floor was wet, and the pre-dawn dark was the specific dark that came just before the sky began its preliminary work of becoming morning, the dark that was not quite the dark of midnight but had a different quality to it, thinner somehow, less committed to itself. Caleb moved to the fissure opening and looked out for a long time, reading the canyon the way he read everything, not just the surface, but what was underneath it. There is something I need to tell you, he said without turning. Before we go further, she waited. I told you I came from the Dragoon Mountains, the northern ridges. He was still looking out at the canyon. What I have not told you is why I went there, why I stayed. He turned then and looked at her in the thin pre-dawn light that was just beginning to reach the fissure opening. I was a scout before, for the army. For 3 years I worked as a scout for the cavalry in this territory because it was the work I knew, and the pay was reliable, and I believed. He stopped. I believed I was helping. I believed I was keeping the violence from being worse. That having someone between the army and the settlements who understood both sides was better than no one. Clara was very still. I was the scout who mapped the northern canyon routes, he said. Not the settlement itself, but the approaches to it. The water sources, the passages. His voice was completely level, which she now understood cost him a great deal. I did not know what the maps would be used for. I was told it was for defensive purposes, to track movement, to understand the territory. I gave them everything I knew about those canyons. He held her gaze. Let her look at whatever was in his face and see it plainly. Gerald Reed used those maps, he said. My maps. To pinpoint the location of Morning Sky's village for Dent. A pause. I did not know until afterward. until I came back and found what I found, until I understood what my work had been used for. He looked out at the canyon again. I've spent 3 years on that mountain because I did not know where else to go. Because I was not Apache enough for the canyon people after what happened and not white enough for the towns. And because the one thing I had believed I was doing, keeping people safer, had been turned into the instrument of killing the person I loved utmost in the world. The canyon held the silence after that. Clara sat with it. She did not reach for comforting words or manageable reframings. She just sat with the full weight of what he had said and let it be as heavy as it was. Then she said, "Dent used you. Gerald Reed used you. They took what you gave in good faith, and they turned it towards something you would never have consented to. That is not a thing you carry alone." She looked at him steadily. "That is a thing we are going to face together, with whatever is in Old Crow's keeping. And we are going to make sure the men who arranged it are not going to be able to arrange anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. In the growing light, she could see his face more clearly than she had been able to see it in the dark. And what she saw in it was not the expression of a man being offered comfort. It was the expression of a man being seen accurately for the first time in 3 years, which was a different thing and more serious, and worth more. "We need to move," he said. Before first light finds us in the open, she stood. Her back registered its objections to several hours of sandstone with some specificity. But she was functional and she was warm enough, and she realized. Not afraid in the general shapeless way she had been afraid since the evening she had first seen Dent ride down her street. The fear now had a direction and a specific shape, and things with a specific shape were things you could work with. Caleb looked out at the canyon floor one more time. His attention sharpened. She saw it happen, the slight change in how he was holding himself that meant something in the information coming in had changed. "What is it?" she said. He pointed. Not down into the wash they had avoided yesterday. Up northeast toward the high rock country where the canyon walls rose into the first pale suggestion of morning sky, footprints in the wet mud of the canyon floor below, fresh. The marn still sharp, pressed into earth that had set somewhat in the hours since the rain stopped, but had not set fully. Someone had come through here after the monsoon, moving north, moving with the specific urgency of someone who knew where they were going and was not stopping for anything along the way. The size and spacing of them said someone moving fast. The direction said north. Toward Old Crow, Clara's chest tightened. His men, one of them. The others may have been driven back by the floodwater in the lower wash. Caleb was already looking toward the northeast. But this one found a way through. How far ahead? 2 hours. Less if he was running. She looked at the footprints in the mud and thought about a piece of paper kept in a rock niche for 3 years by a man who believed someone would come, who knew what to do with it. She thought about what it would mean if Dent's man reached Old Crow before they did. "Then we move south," she said. Right now, they moved out of the fissure and into the early gray light, the wet stone of the canyon floor cold and slick under their boots. Moving north, moving fast. The canyon around them was waking the birds beginning their preliminary remarks about the coming dawn. The light thickening from gray toward the first tentative gold at the rim of the eastern wall. Whatever was waiting for them up in the high rock, it was not going to wait while they deliberated about it. Nothing worth protecting ever did. The canyon country northeast of Copperstone was a different landscape than anything below it. Up here the walls were higher and the color had shifted from the bright arterial red of the lower canyon to something deeper, the red of old iron, of stone that had been accumulating its particular experience for a very long time and wore it without apology. The ponderosa pines appeared at the higher elevations, growing directly out of rock faces in ways that should not have been structurally possible, but apparently no one had informed the trees of this, and they had proceeded accordingly. The air tasted of pine resin and the sharp, clean aftermath of the monsoon. Every stone surface was still wet, and the early morning light turned the moisture into something that looked briefly like hammered silver before the angle changed, and it became just wet rock again. Clara's boots had stopped being dry somewhere in the previous afternoon. She had stopped noticing Caleb moved ahead of her, and she followed the exact placement of his feet on stone, rather than loose earth where possible, along the edges of boulders rather than through the gaps between them, up rather than around when the terrain offered both options. She understood why. Up was harder and slower and left less evidence than around. And evidence was precisely what they could not afford to leave. His shoulder held. She watched for the signs she had learned to read, the slight catch in his breathing that meant the joint was being asked for more than it currently wanted to give. The microscopic adjustment in how he used his left arm to compensate. The signs were present but faint. The healing had done what healing did when the wound was treated correctly, and the body was given what it needed to work with. They did not speak. The terrain was part of it, but not all of it. The other part was what Caleb had told her in the pre-dawn dark outside the fissure, the thing he had been carrying alongside the grief for 3 years, the specific knowledge of his own unwitting role in the chain of events that had ended in the settlement. But she had not tried to diminish it, and she was not going to diminish it now. She had said what was true. He had been used by men who understood exactly what they were doing and had counted on him not understanding it. That was not guilt. But it lived in the same house as guilt, and it was understandable that a person who had moved in with it 3 years ago had stopped being able to tell the rooms apart. She thought about this as she climbed, and she thought about the footprints in the wet mud, and she thought about what they were going toward and what it was going to require of both of them when they got there. Then she stopped thinking and just climbed. Old Crow's territory revealed itself not as a destination, but as a recognition. One moment they were moving through canyon country that looked like any other section of this particular landscape: sandstone walls, pine-scattered ledges, the occasional fierce blooming of something small and yellow between the rocks that had no business being that cheerful in this kind of terrain. The next moment Clara understood that she was looking at something that had been inhabited with intention for a very long time. And the understanding came not from any single feature, but from the cumulative quality of everything together. The way the ledges were arranged relative to the sun, the way water would run off the upper rock faces in a rain, the way a person standing at a certain point would have sight lines in 4 directions simultaneously without now being visible from any of them. A place chosen by someone who understood what choosing a place meant. Old Crow was sitting at the edge of the uppermost ledge, not hiding, not alarmed. Sitting with his legs crossed and his hands resting open on his knees in the posture of someone who had been sitting in exactly this configuration for many years and had found it satisfactory and saw no reason to change it on account of visitors. He was watching their approach with eyes that missed nothing and registered everything and gave away only what he chose to give away, which was not much. He was old in the way the canyon was old, not diminished by it. Thoroughly made by it, the way stone was shaped by time and pressure into something that had more integrity at the end of the process than it had at the beginning. Dent's man was nowhere visible. Clara looked at the ledges and the alcoves, and the carefully tended arrangements of Old Crow's long occupation, and did not see him. She looked at Old Crow. He met her eyes with the measured steadiness of someone who had assessed the situation fully and had arrived at a position regarding it some time before they had arrived. Caleb climbed the last section to the upper ledge and spoke in Apache, low, direct, the particular cadence of someone speaking their second language with a fluency built over years rather than study. She understood none of the words and understood the conversation completely, the rhythm of it, the pauses, the way Old Crow's eyes moved between Caleb's face and hers as each sentence landed. When Caleb finished, Old Crow was quiet for a moment, not considering he had already considered. The quiet was the pause of a man who had decided what to say and was choosing the precise form in which to say it. He answered. Caleb listened without interrupting, his face doing the careful work of translation in real time, and when Old Crow finished, Caleb said, "The man came through before dawn." Old Crow watched him from the upper rock. He was moving through the territory looking for something, but he did not know what he was looking for, which meant he did not find it. He turned back south after less than an hour. Clara exhaled once, carefully. "Report back to Dent." "Yes, but he will report that he found nothing." "High Rock Old Camp, no one there." Caleb glanced at Old Crow, who had not moved from his position at the ledge edge. 3 years of practice. Old Crow said something else. Short. Directed at Clara specifically, his eyes on her face as he said it. She looked at Caleb. "He says you move well on stone," Caleb told her. "He could see you from the upper rock as you came up. He says," a brief pause that had something in it she couldn't quite read. "He says morning sky moved the same way." like someone who had decided the ground was going to hold them and was not going to waste energy on doubt about it. Clara looked at Old Crow. He was watching her with those eyes that gave away only what he chose. She did not look away, and she did not speak immediately, because there were no words she had in any language that were adequate to what was being offered in that comparison, and offering inadequate words when silence would do was a habit she had been working on breaking. She nodded once, slowly, with the full weight of what she understood it to mean. Old Crow nodded back, the same weight, the same slowness, an acknowledgement that moved between them without requiring translation. Then he stood with the ease of someone whose body had long since negotiated its particular piece with its own limitations and had found the terms acceptable, and he went to a niche in the far wall of the ledge and came back with something wrapped in trade cloth. He set it down between them and unwrapped it, and Clara looked at what was inside, a single sheet of paper. Government paper, she could tell by the particular weight and texture of it even before she read a word. The kind of paper used by official institutions that needed their documents to be taken seriously and had made the material itself part of the argument. It was creased from having been folded and refolded many times, and the creases had gone soft with age, but the writing on it was entirely legible. She looked at Caleb. Something had changed in his face. Not broken, Caleb Morrow's face did not break. But it had moved, the way ground moves in the moment before you realize an earthquake has passed through it. A shift so fundamental that everything on the surface was in a slightly different position than it had been. He kept it, Caleb said. His voice was in a register she had not heard from him before. Not unsteady. Just coming from a different place than his usual voice came from. He went back after, to what was left, and he found it on the ground as she looked down at the document, military letterhead, a date spring 1880. Orders for a cavalry engagement at a specific location in the Northern Canyon Territory of Arizona. The stated purpose of the engagement, written in the same bloodless transactional language that Gerald Reed had used in his journal, the language of men who had decided that the clearest sign of their own authority was the ability to describe catastrophic things without their voices changing. Clearance of indigenous occupancy at location as specified by civilian contractor for the purpose of enabling lawful mineral extraction clearance. Occupancy. Enabling at the bottom 2 signatures, the first H. Dent, Captain, U.S. 6th Cavalry, the second, the required countersignature of a superior officer, a colonel whose name she didn't recognize. Below that, a notation in a different hand, civilian contractor, G. Reed, Gerald Reed's name on a military document, Dent's name above it, the location in the Northern Canyon. The stated purpose, this was not a dead man's private journal that a defense lawyer could argue was the product of guilt or deteriorating judgment. This was the government's own record, signed, countersigned, dated, filed and then thrown away by men who thought that throwing away was sufficient. It was not sufficient. Old Crow had made sure of that. Clara looked up at him. He kept this for 3 years, she said. Caleb translated. Old Crow listened and then answered, his eyes on Clara as he spoke. He says he kept it because the earth keeps what matters, Caleb told her, and returns it when the time is right. He says he was not certain who would come. He thought perhaps it would be me. A pause. He says when he saw you come up the stone just now, he understood it was both of us. That it required both. Clara held the document carefully, the way you held something that was both fragile and extremely dangerous. She thought about Owen Garrett and his deed records, and the 3 pages of her handwriting now sitting in a building 2 doors west of the dry goods store in Copperstone. She thought about Silas Dent and his practiced pleasantness and his federal badge. She thought about what she was holding and what it meant and what it was going to take to make it mean something in a room where it mattered. We need to go back, she said. Caleb looked at her. Not to run, she held his gaze. To finish it, they came down out of the canyon in the afternoon, when the sun was at its highest and the light was the flat white that erased shadows and made the landscape look like something in a dream. 3 of them. Old Crow had not been asked, had not needed to be. He had simply begun preparing to descend when Clara said they were going back, with the unhurried efficiency of someone for whom the decision had already been made some time ago, and he had only been waiting for the other parties to catch up to it. The descent took half the time the ascent had. Gravity was enthusiastic and required no encouragement. Clara used the descent to think. Not about the fear was present and she had received its information, and she did not need to keep receiving it. She thought about the specific mechanics of what came next. She thought about Dent and the way he operated, the patience of him, the pleasantness that was a weapon, the fact that he had been waiting for the right moment rather than forcing one. She thought about what changed when you removed his certainty that the journal was the only record of what he had done. She thought about what it meant to a man like that to understand that the information had already left the room and was already in the hands of people he could not threaten. She thought about what it would take to make him visible. Not to her, she had been able to see him clearly since the first evening. To the town. To the people who had been living alongside a man wearing a federal badge and extending him the considerable benefit of the doubt that badge carried, because that was what people did with federal badges in 1883, in a territory that was still figuring out what law meant and who was allowed to dispense it. By the time they reached the lower canyon and the North Road came back into view, she knew what she was going to do. She told Caleb as they walked. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, the thorough quiet of someone working through the specific mechanics of a plan and looking for the places where it might fail. Dent will move the moment he sees us come back into town, he said. Yes, he cannot afford to let us reach Garrett, no. Which is why we do not go to Garrett first. She looked at him steadily. We go directly to the center of Main Street, all three of us, in daylight, where everyone can see. Caleb looked at Old Crow, who was just walking slightly ahead of them on the road with the self-contained purpose of a man who had somewhere to be and was going there. Then he looked back at Clara. You are asking him to walk into a town that has not seen him in 3 years, a town where, I am not asking him, she said. He decided to come down with us. I think he has known for some time what coming down would mean and has been waiting for the right circumstances. She paused. He kept that paper for 3 years, Caleb. He knew what he was keeping it for. Caleb was quiet for another moment. Then, you think like someone who has been managing a difficult situation alone for a long time. I have been managing a difficult situation alone for a long time. She kept walking. The difference now is that I am not alone. They came into Copperstone from the North Road as the sun began its afternoon descent. The light shifting from the flat white of noon toward the long gold of late afternoon that turned the buildings on Main Street into something that looked briefly like it might be worth keeping. Clara knew they had been seen before they reached the end of the street. This was not a large town, and it had been without much to pay attention to for long enough that Thiflp Pemeline coming in from the North Road, a woman who had not been seen since the morning before, a large man who had not been seen at all, and a Chiricahua elder who had not been seen in 3 years constituted the kind of event that collected observers without any effort. She saw the movement in her peripheral vision. A man stepping back from the doorway of the dry goods store. A woman on the far boardwalk pausing mid-step. Tommy Briggs at the entrance to the livery, one hand still holding a lead rope. Looking, she kept walking, straight down the center of the street. They went to Garrett's office first, not because it was the safe choice, because it was the necessary one. Because the specific sequence of events she had worked out on the descent required that Garrett know what she was carrying before anyone else in Copperstone did, and required that he have it in his hands before Dent understood that she was back in town. The bell above the door sounded, and Garrett looked up from the press with his oblique attention, and took in the three of them and set down his tool with the manner of a man who had been expecting something, and was recalibrating which specific thing it had turned out to be. Mrs. Reed, his eyes moved to Caleb, to Old Crow. Back to her. You brought company. I did. She was already at the counter. She unwrapped the oilskin and set the military document on top of the journal and pushed both toward him. There is a second document, the one Gerald described in the journal. Old Crow has been keeping it. Garrett looked at the military paper. His expression did not change, which was the expression of a man whose job had required him for 30 years to receive extraordinary information in a consistently functional state. He read it once through completely. Then he set it down and looked up. This is signed by Dent, he said. Yes, when he was a captain, yes. Before the badge and the civilian contractor is Gerald Reed. She held his gaze. I need you to send this to the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson. Not a summary, the full document, along with everything I gave you before. I need it sent today. Garrett looked at the document again. The stage south doesn't leave until tomorrow morning, I know, which is why I need you to use the telegraph. Garrett was quiet for a moment. The oblique look had gone direct, which she had come to understand meant the situation had crossed from interesting into serious, and he was treating it accordingly. Henderson lets me use the assay office wire. I'll need 20 minutes to write out a full transmission. Then start now. She kept her voice even. Dent's man came through the northern canyon before dawn this morning. He found nothing, but he will have reported back, and Dent will be calculating his next move. We have a window of time between his learning we are back in town and his understanding that the document is already on its way to Tucson. I would like to use that window. Garrett picked up the military document, looked at it one more time. Then he went around the counter and through the back door without another word, moving with the purposeful quiet of a man who understood what was being asked of him and had already decided to do it. Clara turned. Caleb was standing near the shelves of old editions along the east wall, looking at nothing in particular, in the way he stood when he was listening to the building around him, rather than what was inside it. Old Crow was near the door, looking at the printing press with an combined complete inscrutability with something that might have been, in a person who expressed things more openly, fascination. 20 minutes, Caleb said. Not to her specifically. To the room, give or take. Dent will know we are back before then. Yes, he will come here probably. Caleb looked at her. And when he does, we do not leave, she said it simply, without drama, because it was simply true. This is the Copperstone Clarion. Whatever happens in this building is going to be the most documented event in this town's history, and Silas Dent has spent 30 years making very sure that nothing he does is documented. They waited. The minutes moved. Outside, the sounds of the afternoon street continued their ordinary work, a wagon, voices, the distant rhythm of the smithy. Inside, the press smelled of ink and the old paper smell of decades of editions stacked against every available wall. And Old Crow stood near the door with his complete and self-contained stillness, and Caleb stood near the east wall in his, and Clara stood at the counter and kept her hands flat on it and breathed steadily. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, she was too far from the door for footsteps through the ambient noise of the afternoon street. But there was a change in the quality of the sounds outside, a subtle shift in how people were moving, the specific alteration that happened when someone with authority was crossing space and everyone else was unconsciously adjusting around it. The door opened. Silas Dent came in. He took in the room in a single sweep: the press, the counter, Clara, Caleb, Old Crow, and for the first time since she had seen him ride down her street, the pleasantness of his features faltered, not collapsed, just faltered. The way a well-maintained facade faltered when something it had not accounted for appeared without warning. He had not accounted for Old Crow. She watched him account for Old Crow now, the rapid internal recalculation of a man who had spent 30 years being 3 steps ahead of every situation and was currently working out whether he was still 3 steps ahead of this one. His eyes moved to Clara. The pleasantness returned because it was too ingrained to stay absent for long, Mrs. Reed. I'd heard you'd been away. I am back, so I see. His gaze moved to the counter where the oilskin lay open and empty, back to her face. Something behind his eyes had become very still. I hope your trip north was productive. It was. She kept her hands flat on the counter. I found what you have been looking for. The stillness behind his eyes intensified. Is that right? Gerald Reed's journal. And something that was with it she did not reach for either. Just named them. Let the naming do what naming could do before anything else was required. A military order, signed by a Captain H. Dent of the 6th Cavalry. Countersigned by a superior officer. Authorizing an engagement in the Northern Canyon Territory of Arizona Territory. She paused. For the purpose of clearing the land for private mineral extraction, the room was very quiet. Dent's 2 men were positioned at the door behind him. Neither had moved, but the quality of their stillness had changed into the stillness of men waiting for a signal to arrive. That document, Dent said. His voice had changed, still controlled. But the pleasantness had been put away, efficiently and without regret, the way you put away a tool when it had served its purpose and a different tool was required. Does not belong to you. It belongs to the federal government that issued it, she said. And the territorial marshal's office in Tucson is receiving a telegraph transmission describing its full contents right now. along with the complete account of Gerald Reed's journal entries detailing the arrangement between yourself and a civilian contractor. She held his gaze. It left this building approximately 15 minutes ago. Dent looked at her. She looked back. He looked past her to the back door through which Garrett had disappeared. Looked at the empty oilskin on the counter. Looked at Old Crow standing near the front door, who had not moved and had not changed his expression and was looking at Dent with the complete, unhurried attention of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for 3 years and found it exactly as he had expected. Something happened in Dent's face then. Something she had not expected and would not forget. It was not rage, and it was not calculation. She had seen both of those from him and knew what they looked like. This was something older than both. The expression of a man who had been building a particular version of events for a very long time and was watching, for the first time, the construction begin to fail from its foundation upward. Not collapse. Dent was too experienced and too controlled for collapse. But the expression of a man who had arrived at a new arithmetic and did not like the answer it was producing. His hand moved toward the revolver at his hip. Caleb spoke. He did not raise his voice. He almost never raised his voice. There are 3 witnesses in this building and a newspaper owner who left through the back door 18 minutes ago. You are standing in the Copperstone Clarion. Whatever you do in the next 30 seconds will be written down. Dent's hand stopped. The 2 men at the door looked at each other. Not the look of men preparing to execute an order. The look of men reconsidering what they were doing here and for whom. You cannot prove, Dent started. The document is in Tucson, Clara said, or it will be before this day is finished. And the journal entries describing the arrangement are already in this building in the possession of Owen Garrett, which means they are already in the possession of the Copperstone Clarion. Which means they are already in the possession of every reader in this territory who receives this paper. She paused. I am not the only person who has read what you signed. I am not the only person who knows what Gerald Reed's journal contains. You are not going to be able to take it back. Dent was very still. The 2 men at the door, she watched it happen, took a step back. Not a dramatic step, just a step. The step of men who had made a new calculation and had arrived at a different answer than the one they had come in with. The front door opened. Owen Garrett came back through the front, not the back. He was carrying a carbon copy of telegraph correspondence that he set down on the counter without looking at anyone, and the paper had the specific appearance of an official transmission that had been sent and acknowledged. He looked at Dent from his oblique angle. Message is sent and confirmed received, he said, to the room, to the record, to whatever account of this moment someone would eventually write. Transmission included full content of a military order dated spring 1880, signed by 1H Dent, Captain, 6th Cavalry, and the relevant entries from the private journal of Gerald W. Reed detailing the arrangement between himself and the same individual. He set the carbon copy down precisely. That's for the paper's records. We keep records of all official transmissions. Dent looked at the carbon copy. He looked at Old Crow. He looked at Clara. He looked at Caleb, who had not moved from the east wall and was watching him with the steady, patient attention of a man who had been living in the mountains for 3 years, waiting for the specific shape of this moment to arrive, and had finally found it. One of the men at the door walked out, just turned and walked out. No explanation offered, none requested. Dent's jaw was set in a way that Clara recognized the way of a man holding something that was larger than the room if he let it expand. Except what Dent was holding was not grief. It was the understanding that the arrangement he had been managing for 3 years had just become unmanageable, and that the specific sequence of events he had built his safety around had just been permanently altered, and that the woman he had looked through a window at and assessed as the least dangerous person in a small frontier town had turned out to be something else entirely. This is not over, he said. And the pleasantness was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was exactly what she had suspected from the first evening. Not something worse than the pleasantness, just something more honest. A man who wanted things and had found a way to take them and had now found a way that was closed. You are correct, Clara said. The Territorial Marshal's office will finish what we have started. But what is finished today, what is finished right now? In this room is your leverage. The information is no longer only in the journal. The journal is no longer only with me. and you are no longer operating in a town where no one knows your history before the badge." Dent looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked one more time at Old Crow, and in that look was everything he had spent 3 years and considerable effort trying to make sure would never happen: the past standing in a room with the present, refusing to be separated from it. He walked out. The second man followed without being asked. The door closed. The bell above it rang once clearly and went quiet. The silence in the room after that was a different quality than the silence before, fuller. Clara became aware of her own heartbeat, which had been present throughout and carefully managed, and was now, with the immediate pressure lifted, communicating its preferences about what had just happened with some emphasis. She looked at her hands on the counter. Steady. Garrett looked at the front door, then at Clara, then at Old Crow. "I'll need a formal statement," he said, "for the paper." "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. They walked out into the afternoon. The long gold light of late day had taken over Main Street fully now, the kind of light that made everything look as though it had been considered carefully before it was allowed to continue existing. Clara walked down the center of the street with Caleb at her left and Old Crow moving at his own pace on her right, and she felt the attention of the town before she saw the specific faces it belonged to. It was not a dramatic gathering. It was slower and more ordinary, and that the human instinct to pay attention to the unusual was a reliable instinct. And 3 people walking down the center of Main Street in company that Copperstone had decided did not belong together was unusual enough to pull people out of their ordinary afternoon without any formal announcement being required. Tommy Briggs had come out of the livery. Henderson was on the step of the assay office. The woman from the boarding house, Mrs. Callahan, who had not spoken to Clara once in 2 years, not a nod, not a good morning, was on her porch with her hands folded in front of her. Old Crow stopped walking in the center of the street. He stood there for a moment in the late afternoon light, this man who had kept a piece of government paper in a rock niche in the high canyon for 3 years because he believed someone would come who would know what to do with it. And he looked at the town around him with those eyes that gave away only what he chose. Then he spoke. He spoke for a long time in Apache, not loudly, in a voice that carried the way voices carried when there was something true inside them that gave the sound a different quality to ordinary speech. Clara understood none of the words. She understood all of it. She watched the street and the people on it the way they stayed where they had come out to stand rather than retreating back through their doors, and she understood that whatever Old Crow was saying was communicating itself in a register below language, in the register where truth arrived before the specific words for it did. Caleb translated beside her, not simultaneously in pieces, as Old Crow paused, as though giving the English words space to land separately from the Apache ones. A canyon, a settlement in it, built over many generations. The particular autumn when that ended, the spring that followed, 3 years in the high rock, keeping something that needed to be kept until the right time. A paper with a soldier's signature on it, found on the ground by a man who understood what it meant and what it would eventually be needed for. The name of the civilian contractor written at the bottom, the name of the officer who had arranged the clearance, who had then put on a different kind of authority and come back years later for the last piece of the record that connect him to what he had done, and then, once morning sky. Said simply, her name in the open air of Copperstone's Main Street in the long gold light of a late afternoon, spoken by the man who had been there when she died and had carried that fact with the same care he had carried the paper as something that mattered, something that deserved to be treated as real. Caleb went very still beside her. She felt it, the held quality of him, the particular stillness that was the absence of feeling but its most concentrated form. She put her hand into his without deciding to. His fingers closed around hers, and the grip was not the grip of someone reaching for support. It was the grip of someone who had been given something and was holding it carefully. Old Crow finished speaking. The street held the silence after it the way the canyon held sound, receiving it, letting it exist, not rushing to fill it with something else. Then Mrs. Callahan stepped down from her porch. She crossed the street with the directness of a woman who had made a decision and was executing it before she could talk herself out of it. She was tall, gray at the temples, with the bearing of someone who had been in Copperstone since before most of the buildings on this street existed, and who carried that history with the particular weight of someone who knew exactly what it contained, and was not always comfortable with that knowledge. She stopped in front of Clara. She did not say anything. She raised her hand and placed it on Clara's shoulder, not patting, not gripping, just placing it there with the deliberate intention of a person who understood that the gesture itself was the message, and words would only make it smaller. Clara looked at the hand on her shoulder, then at Mrs. Callahan's face. The older woman met her eyes without flinching and without explanation, and then she removed her hand and stepped back. It was enough. It was in fact precisely sufficient. Not forgiveness, there was nothing to forgive Clara for. Not welcome, she had been here for 2 years, and welcome had long since become irrelevant. It was something else, something without a clean single word for it. The acknowledgement by one person that another person had done something worth acknowledging, offered publicly, offered simply, offered without requiring anything in return. The wall between Clara Reed and the town of Copperstone did not fall dramatically. Walls did not fall dramatically. They just became less necessary. And unnecessary things found their way to the ground on their own schedule. Henderson stepped down from the office step. Tommy Briggs had put down the lead rope. 2 women from the dry goods store had come out and were standing on the boardwalk. Nobody was leaving. Old Crow looked at Caleb, said something brief, in Apache that was clearly not for the town's benefit, but for his. Caleb listened. Something moved across his face, not quickly, but the way a long-held thing moved when it was finally given permission to move. He once, and the nod carried a weight that had nothing to do with agreement and everything to do with receiving something that had been a long time coming. Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. In the gold light of the afternoon street, with the town arranged around them and the sound of Old Crow's voice still sitting in the air, she saw in his face something that had not been there when he fallen from his horse in the dark in front of her door a week ago. It was not happiness. Exactly, happiness was too simple a word for it. It was the specific expression of a person who had been carrying a weight for so long that they had restructured themselves around it, and who was now discovering that the restructuring had not been permanent, that the weight could be set down, that what was underneath it was still there, and still functional, and still capable of being whatever I did to be next. He was still himself. He was just lighter. In the way that mattered, Dent left Copperstone before sunset. She knew because Tommy Briggs, who noticed horses the way other people noticed weather, found her an hour after the scene on Main Street and told her that Dent and his remaining man had ridden south on the main road with the manner of men who were not planning to come back the same way they had gone. Whether that was flight or tactical retreat, she could not say for certain. She thought it was probably both, and she thought that the distinction mattered less than the direction, which was away. The territorial marshal arrived from Tucson 8 days later. 2 of them, a deputy and a senior officer whose badge was larger, and whose manner was the manner of someone who had read a telegraph very carefully and wanted to see the specific documents described in it with his own eyes. Clara sat with them in the Clarion for 2 hours and answered every question in the careful, precise way she communicated when accuracy mattered more than brevity. Caleb sat beside her. Garrett had his notes. Old Crow's account, as Caleb had translated it on Main Street, had been written down by Garrett the following morning and was included in the documentation. The senior marshal looked at the military order for a long time. He was a gray-haired man of about 55, with a face that had organized a great deal of difficult information into a permanent expression of cautious assessment. He looked at the signature at the bottom, then at the counter-signature, that Gerald Reed's name in the contractor notation. Dent, he said, finally. Yes, I know that name from before the badge. He did not elaborate on what he knew about it. He did not need to. What happened after that happened in courtrooms and federal offices that Clara was not present for and did not need to be present for. She gave a formal deposition. She sent the journal, registered mail, to the federal court in Tucson, and it went where it needed to go. She received letters occasionally, formal and procedural, and she answered them in the same tone and filed them in the cedar chest that had been repurposed from a place where things were hidden to a place where things were kept. The kept things and the hidden things were different categories. She had learned that. The difference between them was that kept things were available when you needed them, and hidden things were only available by accident or desperation, and she had decided she was no longer in the business of waiting for either. The seasons turned. The canyon country moved through them with the indifference of things that measured time differently than people did, in geological rather than human increments. The mesquite bloomed in the spring, and the monsoon came and went in the summer, and the ponderosa pines did something, with autumn light at the high elevations, that Clara still could not entirely describe to anyone who had not seen it themselves. She went up to see it regularly, now. The high canyon had stopped being a place she moved through in urgency and become a place she moved through deliberately, with attention, learning its specific language the way she had learned the language of the thickets below by touch and smell, and repeated encounter until the knowledge was in her hands rather than just in her head. Caleb had spent the late summer and early autumn building, not quickly. He was not a man who did things quickly when doing them right required time, and he had decided that this particular thing required time, and he had given it that without apology. The house sat in the eastern valley below the Dragoon Mountains, on the land that Old Crow's people had sanctioned for them, not granted, not deeded in any formal legal sense, but designated in the older and more serious way that some designations were made, the way that carried the weight of a community's intention behind it rather than a piece of paper. Timber from the higher elevation. Adobe for the thick walls held the night's coolness into the morning, and turned the afternoon heat back rather than absorbing it. A long porch facing east, so the day came in first, and the worst of the afternoon stayed on the other side of the roof. Her shelves, 3 rows, the same configuration she had used in the apothecary in Copperstone, because the configuration worked and she had learned that working things deserved to be kept rather than replaced with theoretical improvements. The jars were in the same order. The mountain mint was in the second position from the left on the top shelf, where the morning light reached it first. She had a better window for it now. A young Apache woman named Runs with River came to her door in November with a cough that wanted treatment and came back afterward for reasons that had nothing to do with the cough. She's had quick hands and quicker comprehension, and a tolerance for being corrected that Clara found both rare and valuable, and she came twice a week through the winter and was learning things that took most people considerably longer to learn. Clara liked her immediately, and Run trusted her 3 weeks later and told her so, which seemed to surprise Runs with River and then to stop surprising her. Caleb came in from the cold one December evening, with his coat carrying the particular compound of pine and cold air and the mineral scent of the high canyon that she had long since associated specifically with him and with no other place or person. He had been up to Old Crow's territory. He went regularly. Old Crow knew he was coming and expected it, and received it with the same complete lack of ceremony with which he received most things. She had dinner on the stove. She handed him the tin mug of coffee she had poured when she heard the horse on the path. He took it, and their fingers overlapped on the mug in the easy way of people who had stopped managing the space between them and simply lived in it. He looked at her face in the lamplight. The inventory, the attentive reading of her that had begun the morning after his fever broke and had not stopped. She had stopped finding it anything other than what it was, the way Caleb Morrow paid attention to things he cared about, complete, unhurried. Without performance, Old Crow sends something, he said. He reached into his coat and produced a small bundle wrapped in trade cloth, tied with a strip of leather. She took it and unwrapped it, inside. Dried herbs, bound together with care. She brought them to the lamp and turned them, and the smell came up clean and specific, and somehow both medicinal and ceremonial in equal measure, not opposed to each other, just occupying the same space, which was how the best things worked. She looked at Caleb, used in the canyon country when something that needed ending has ended, he said, and something else has begun in its place. He paused. He said we would know when. Clara looked at the bundle in her hands. She looked at the room around her, the shelves in their right order, the lamp burning steadily, the dinner on the stove and the smell of the high canyon on Kekalev's coat, and outside the window the eastern valley going quiet in the way it went quiet in December when the cold came down from the ridgeline, and the night arrived early and with intention, she thought. I know when. She set the herbs down on the work table. Then she turned to Caleb and looked at him directly in the lamplight with the same steadiness she had offered him the night. She had told him he was not right carrying the way he thought he was carrying, and she said, "There is something I need to tell you." He set down the mug. He gave his full attention, which was the kind of full attention that left no part of itself elsewhere. She told him. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the room 2 steps. Because in this house there were not many steps between any 2 places, which she had liked from the first morning she had woken up in it, and he raised both hands and held her face between them, his palms warm from the mug, his thumbs resting along her jaw in the careful way he did most things. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. In the lamplight his eyes held something she did not try to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. Then he pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that in the kitchen of their house in the Eastern Valley, while the fire in the stove did its work, and the night settled around the adobe walls, and the herbs from Old Crow sat on the work table waiting for their right moment, which was already here. Outside, the canyon was doing what the canyon always did, indifferent, permanent, ongoing, pursuing its own long timeline without regard for the specific small dramas of the people at its edge. It had seen prospectors and soldiers and arrangements made between men who thought the landscape was a problem to be solved. It had held what was given to it and returned it in its own time, which was not always the time anyone would have chosen, but was always, eventually, the right time. Inside the house, a man and a woman stood in the lamplight in the kitchen they had built together. And what was beginning between them had been beginning since a storm and a wounded man and a cedar chest that had been closed for too long was not a small thing dressed up to look large. It was the actual large thing, the kind that did not announce itself loudly or arrive with ceremony, but simply took root in the ordinary days, in the specific weight of a hand on a shoulder, and the way a man held a coffee mug, and the particular silence between 2 people who had stopped needing to fill it. She had spent 2 years carrying a name that wasn't hers and living in a house that held someone else's sins in a chest under the floorboards. She had spent 2 years being the woman at the edge of the town that the town looked past rather than at, keeping herself functional with the discipline of someone who had decided that surviving was what was available and had decided to be good at it. She was still good at surviving. She had simply discovered that it was not the only thing available after all. In the spring the valley would green along the creek line. In the summer the monsoon would come down from the high ridges and turn the canyon floor red and the dry washes into rivers for the hours it took the land to drink what it had been given. In the autumn the light would do what it did with the ponderosa pines, the thing she couldn't describe. And through fall of it, in the house in the Eastern Valley, there would be the sound of 2 people moving through their days, the specific and unremarkable sounds of a life being lived rather than endured, which was the most remarkable sound there was, and the most ordinary, and the one she intended to go on making for a very long time. Caleb lifted his head, looked at her. The question in his eyes was not a question, it was the expression of a man who had already received the answer, and was still in the process of believing it was real. She took the herbs from the work table, held them for a moment. Then she placed them on the second shelf, in the gap she had left between the mountain mint and the osha root where the morning light would reach them first. Some things you kept where the light could find them. She turned back to him. He was watching her with the complete attention she had come to know, as the way he moved through the world, fully present in it, not managing his distance from it, not holding himself apart from whatever it was going to ask of him next. "Come eat," she said. He came.